broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Policy and Practice's latest webinar. We're delighted to have so many of you here on the webinar this morning, on this lovely sunny morning here in Westminster. I hope it's sunny where you are. So thank you very much for joining us. Today's webinar is looking at the Homelessness Reduction Act. And while we get ourselves started, I would, and a few more people do join us, I'd like to just take you through a little bit of housekeeping, if I may. If you're not familiar with our webinar functionality, there is a panel on the right-hand side, and I'll just do an audio check with you. If you could just raise your digital hands for me while I'm talking, that would let us know that you can hear us perfectly. Also in the same panel, you'll see the ability to ask some questions. So please do ask them in there as they come to you during the webinar. There's time at the end for the Q&As. We'll also have one poll and a survey at the end, and we will have you on your way by 11:30 this morning. Thank you very much for raising your hands. I see that you can hear us. Okay, so with that, I shall very quickly give a little bit of an introduction to it. We've got lots of interest in today's webinar. So for anybody who doesn't know Policy and Practice, just a couple of words about who we are. So we believe that the welfare system can work better. We were founded to help people towards financial independence. We're a policy-led software and analytics business, and we've built 3 core services to make the welfare system simple to understand. Our award-winning benefit and budgeting calculator is used by over 10,000 people daily, and that's available on gov.uk. Our analytics service are used to design local support schemes and show the combined impact of different policies on individual households. The LIFT dashboard, which we're going to be talking about today, it finds trends and relationships in data sets to uncover and visualise the drivers of poverty. So today we're talking about that in the context of the Homelessness Reduction Act, and I think that's, like I say, it's a very interesting webinar for people, lots of interest. We actually talked a little bit about we used the dashboard in a webinar in January where we had Exeter, Chris Buckman from Exeter joined us on that webinar. And I just wanted to share this with you just to give you an idea of what people said the biggest challenges they face on that webinar. And as you can see, homelessness was a massive challenge that people were facing, but also helping people through universal credit rollout was an interesting one as well. So while we are talking about homelessness, Devon's going to talk a little bit about universal credit and just touch on the welfare reform agenda. So that's just we're following up really, if you like, on the webinar from January. So I'm delighted to say that today our guest speakers are Devon Galani from Policy. Sorry, Devon is not our guest speaker. Devon is our speaker from Policy and Practice. Devon, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone.
And we are delighted to have Claire Horton, who is our guest speaker from Newcastle City Council. Claire, would you like to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you very much. It's great to have, and we're delighted that Claire can join us. It's wonderful to have you here, Claire. Thank you very much. So today's agenda, as you can see, quite a lot to get through. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute and hand over, do a little bit of poll, and then get into the meat of the webinar. But essentially what we're talking about today are the introduction to the Homelessness Reduction Act, looking at the context to homelessness, some diving into the duties under the Act, and just looking at the change in approach that it is now required. As I say, we've got Claire talking about the Newcastle City Council's Homelessness Prevention Trailblazer programme, because I think it's very interesting to see how the Act is being, homelessness prevention work is being put into practice on the ground. And so Claire's going to give us a bit of context about Newcastle's work and working with advisors, and also using data to help with the prevention duty. And then Devon's going to give us a demo of our tool, our low-income family tracker dashboard that looks at how to proactively tackle homelessness and also offer personalised support as well. And as I say, there's questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So a lot to get through, and I'm conscious that I've been speaking for a bit of time now. So just to get us underway, and bearing in mind what we just talked there with the Exeter poll, I would like to ask you, what are the main causes of homelessness in your area? The one main cause of homelessness in your area. And Devon is going to put the poll up, so hopefully you'll see the poll here on your screen. We'd love to know, just to set us off today, what you consider is the main cause of homelessness in your area. You can choose one of the following options. So, would you choose as the main cause personal factors, the impact of welfare reforms, income shocks to people, the demand for housing not meeting supply, or is it something that you wouldn't be able to give one answer to? So please do take some time to have a look and consider what you would say is your main factor. Thank you very much. I can see all the votes coming in. It's great to see. I'll just give you a couple more seconds so that more people can vote. There's some very interesting answers coming in here. And I think one of the things that is quite interesting to us in policy and practice is that this answer is different depending on the type of organisation and also where you are geographically in the country as well. So that's an interesting point. So thank you very much. We'll close the poll now and share the responses on your screen. Excellent. Okay. At this point, Devon, over to you.
Yeah, fantastic. And Claire, it would be great to get your thoughts on this. I honestly didn't know what to expect in terms of the response. And actually, I'm going to talk a bit about what, in the next slide, what the National Audit Office and others have said about this. But I'm finding this really interesting because sort of the don't know element is, I think, really telling. We've got a range of organisations on the webinar, but if you've got that homelessness prevention duty and frontline workers in your housing needs service, I think that ability to get some feedback is going to be important. Claire, I'm just conscious that because you're dialing in today, I'll read through some of the results briefly, so you can give your thoughts. So first of all is that 24% said it was personal factors as the main cause of homelessness. 14% said it was the impact of welfare reforms, and 3% said it was the impact of income shocks. 41% said it was the demand for housing not meeting supply in their area, which again is one of those geography is an important driver there. And 17% said don't know. Before you comment on some of those responses, I wondered whether you had any thoughts on what you felt were the main causes of homelessness in Newcastle.
Yeah, I think it's probably for us a combination. It's definitely not the housing supply. You know, we're in a very sort of advantageous position here in terms of our council maintaining control of council housing. We've still got stock. We haven't used bed and breakfast since 2006. So I know that will feel probably quite alien to a lot of people on the call. So I suppose the other side of that is, if accommodation isn't the issue, what is the issue? And I suppose we've got sort of two broad groups who are at risk of homelessness. We've got a large group of thousands of residents who are at risk of having what we call a crisis in their lives. So that's mainly due to poverty that's then been sort of exacerbated by the welfare reforms. And then the other side of it is we have a much smaller group who we call then they've got a life in crisis as opposed to a crisis in their lives. So they're the severe and multiple disadvantage people that are sleeping rough or complex. Solving the housing issue is only a small part of our response to them. So I suppose, it's a combination. But yeah, it's the poverty exacerbated by the welfare reforms, and then the severe and multiple disadvantage smaller group.
Yeah, and I think it also depends a little bit, Claire, on for the organisations on the call, where they are in terms of their homelessness prevention journey. So if you think about homelessness prevention as people that are presenting and are in priority need, who you then need to house, then by definition, finding appropriate housing is going to be more front of mind. Whereas I think where the conversations we've had with Newcastle City Council, and I think where you are, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to talk a bit more about that context, has been pushing toward that more preventative approach around homelessness, but also more holistically in terms of supporting people. And I think that naturally makes you think a little bit more about the triggers and the drivers of homelessness slightly earlier on, which I think is probably reflected in your answer there as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think, because we haven't had that sort of stark issue with the finding the accommodation that other areas will have had, we've then had to think, from a period of going back, many years, well, what is it that's a problem if we still can't get people to secure the accommodation or to maintain the tenancy? What are those underlying issues? So definitely thinking about sort of those other factors in someone's life has been sort of a core part of what we've done for sort of a number of years, predating the being a trailblazer and also predating the Homelessness Reduction Act. But I know we'll come back to that later in the call.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if you are great. So you should be able to see the slides again. If you are, for those of you on the webinar, if you've got questions and you are in much more of a a different situation to Newcastle, we're working with councils, about half a dozen councils across London, if not a few more now, a few others in the southeast, where actually that housing supply is much more of an issue. So very happy to take a few more questions on that as they come in. I wanted to move on and just talk a bit about the context of the Homelessness Reduction Act and a little bit about the drivers of homelessness in terms of what's been reported on. So this analysis comes from either the recent National Audit Office report or information that from the House of Commons Library, where they've pulled together all of the information on the Act, and it's always helpful to share. I think this table is really interesting because in terms of the drivers of homelessness, you see sort of three broad trends. So you've got the end of an assured short hold tenancy, which I think is actually quite reflective of some of the don't knows, because you don't really learn a huge amount in terms of what the underlying driver is there. The landlord has decided to end a tenancy and they don't necessarily have to provide a reason. And actually one of the underlying drivers there could be rent arrears or historical rent arrears, which you see here as being a very low fraction, which astoundingly low really in terms of a driver of homelessness, from my anecdotal knowledge. I think the other big trend there is relationships. So and in two types. So one is parents no longer being able to accommodate, friends, relatives no longer being able to accommodate. So that's kind of where people no longer have anywhere to live, and perhaps sort of we're getting into that life in crisis group, Claire, that you were speaking about earlier. And then you get further in that space when you talk about relationship breakdown, violence between couples. We've got relationship breakdown more generally there as well. And I think, and actually kind of the housing supply point, which earlier in the poll was seen as a bigger issue, is not greatly reflected here. And I think that tells us a little bit about how challenges and changes are, how geography drives and how a local approach needs to be taken toward the homelessness prevention strategy. I'd also say kind of more generally from what we see here on the left-hand side, we see, and this is again in the House of Commons Library report and the National Audit Office analysis, but we see that there is an increase in demand for housing and for affordable homes. That's not being matched by supply, particularly in our work across councils in the south where housing costs are higher. I think the National Audit Office drew attention to the impact of welfare reforms, and we would point to generally the rising cost of living in that context. Again, your local housing market is a big driver of that, and I think there's more work to be done to understand how big a factor that is, but it's certainly a contributing factor in terms of people's ability to find and secure sustainable housing for themselves. And then I think the other one that you've got to acknowledge are the personal factors that can cause homelessness. And often those are the trickiest ones to help people to unwind from and require a lot of intensive support. So yeah, some of the drivers of homelessness there. The context here, I mean, we've got Homelessness Reduction Act. We had universal credit. We still have universal credit rolling out, but actually some of the recent changes in the budget, I think many of you on the call will have found reassuring in terms of helping people to sustain a tenancy. For example, the transition onto universal credit, meaning that people get an additional 2 weeks of housing costs where housing costs are payable. Many people will find reassuring, but equally, I think I just want to emphasize that squeeze in incomes is going to continue in the context of the benefit freeze and in the context of rising living costs, both for rents and for ongoing costs of living. And these are all things that we model and we'll be looking at in the work that we're doing with Newcastle City Council and other authorities. So a little bit of the context there. And do feel free to take this away as it gives you a sense of the changes that are expected and are about to come into effect. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge that the Act poses. The first point to make is that only around half of all homelessness applications are found to be in priority need, whereas a requirement of the Act is that now councils need to work with all of those households that present as homeless and need to work with them to develop a personal housing plan or an action plan, which means that under the new responsibilities, demand could double. You see a sense of the shape of that. So you see actually London has a big share of the homelessness challenge, whereas slightly less than the rest of England. That increase in demand, there is some funding there, but I think certainly local authorities would argue whether or not that's enough to support the households that will be presenting. And I think what it highlights is that prevention is going to be key. That's prevention in the context of your duties under the Act, but also prevention in the context of the fact that local authorities are more generally seeing increasing demand for their services and lower costs to support them. So a number of the authorities we're working with, including Newcastle, but also others, Barking and Dagenham, Luton and others, we're working with them and effectively using homelessness reduction to have a wider conversation within the authority about the effectiveness of a preventative approach. Rough sleeping is another big part of the challenge. There are around 5,000 rough sleepers in England, around 8,000 across the UK. I think that what I took away, what I thought was most telling, is that these numbers have been going up and up and up, and I think that's visible, becoming more and more visible in quite a few places. I find when we go to visit our local authority councils, the walk from the railway station to the council office, you can meet one or two if you want to understand the homelessness problem. And I remember talking to, if it feels appropriate, I've had a conversation with one or two, and it is interesting to think about how they would feel about coming to councils for support. And there is a part of this that means how do you engage people that are in support, that I think can be a bit of a challenge. The other point I wanted to share before moving across to having Claire tell the story of Newcastle City Council is the National Audit Office put a report out on homelessness, which was excellent, really well worth a read if you want to get an understanding and an overview of the Act. They said a couple of points, and I think there's some really powerful things here to take away, is that government efforts to tackle homelessness couldn't demonstrate value for money. So there's a lot of energy around this Act. And I think it's really important that if we're going to make a difference, if the policy is going to have the appropriate effect in practice, is for councils to evaluate effectiveness. So they actually start to demonstrate whether or not their interventions are driving and delivering value for money. And Claire and I will talk a bit about how our work is going to help Newcastle City Council to build that case. I think we also need to help local authorities share best practice, and hopefully we're doing some of that on this webinar, and it would be great to hear your stories and your contribution. They need to help ensure housing supply meets housing need, and to do that you need to get an understanding or ability to forecast what housing need is going to be, and we'll talk a little bit about that too, and then ability to monitor the impacts of policies and interventions that are there to prevent homelessness. The actual Act itself has three main parts and three new elements. So the first is the prevention duty, to take reasonable steps to help applicants secure accommodation. The duty is really, in the legislation, it's to help people within 56 days, increasing that from 28 days to 56 days, which is a huge leap forward. But actually, the councils we're working with, where I think the work is the most interesting and potentially powerful, are those that are going that extra mile to try and support households earlier downstream and taking a more preventative approach. And I think Newcastle falls firmly within that camp, along with other councils that we're working with. On the relief duty, it's about when you identify a household that needs help, you work with them to assess their needs and provide a personalised action plan. And that can be they're often called personal housing plans, but we call them action plans often because it's about all of the actions that they can take toward independence. And one of the things we do, and we're doing with Newcastle, we'll be testing with Newcastle, is the effectiveness of actions our system can generate on a personalised basis for each household that that the team then might then go on to intervene with. And then you've got the ongoing housing duties for where you need to find suitable accommodation. So that's a very brief overview of the Act, and you can download these slides if you want to. I think the final point I'll make before asking Claire a few questions is that this fundamentally, from what I've seen across different local authorities, and Claire, it'd be great for you to comment on this actually, is fundamentally the Act requires a change in approach. So housing needs teams where we've talked to leaders of those teams or worked with those teams directly, I think there is a change in approach required, because advisors are so used to sort of thinking about, the first thing they think about is, are you in priority need? And actually the Act requires you to not think that. You think that very much at the last point. You need to be helping all of your households and all of the people that present in a very personalised and individual way. And I think there's a cultural challenge there. And I think equally, as I've said a couple of times, organisations need to take a more preventative approach to helping those households. And again, there's fundamentally the demand challenge to meet there, but also the kind of the priority. You want to help households before they get into that difficult situation. I'm fully aware of the challenges in this difficult environment, but I think I really struggle to see what the alternatives are. And just on the right hand side, some analysis saying that actually the challenge for households in terms of their ability to bear income shocks is just going to get, particularly for low income households, is just going to get worse and worse. So on to Claire. Hopefully that was interesting, and feel free to ask any more questions if you wanted to cover more on the legislation. I never know quite how in detail. I always feel it's much more interesting to get straight onto the work that our clients are doing. So to understand what steps Newcastle City Council have taken to prepare for the Act, I'll hand over to Claire, and I'll kick off with an initial question. Claire, do you want to just talk a bit more about, you've already said a little bit about the context in Newcastle, and the fact that it's a little bit different in Newcastle to other parts of perhaps other parts of the UK. But do you want to talk a bit about your role and the active inclusion approach that Newcastle City Council are taking as well?
Yeah, so it's probably good for me to just explain for people that haven't heard me or my colleague Neil talk about active inclusion before, what is it? Because it does sound a little bit sort of jargony. But basically, active inclusion is a European concept, and it's around for citizens to be actively included, that they need to have what we call the foundations for a stable life. And our LIFE acronym relates to the L being somewhere to live, the I being an income, the F being financial inclusion, and the E being employment opportunities. And so under sort of austerity, when we first started to get the largest of our local authority cuts back in sort of 2012, 2013, and we were restructuring services and having to sort of make some reductions, we restructured under this kind of approach of active inclusion. At that time, our service, just so you understand, or callers understand where we sit in the authority, we're in the People Directorate, so that's predominantly social care, and our bit of the world that's under active inclusion is our homelessness services, including the housing advice and the statutory accommodation, but it's also welfare rights, debt and budgeting advice, and supported employment. So we then have the directly delivered services that the council can have that will have an impact on those areas of a resident's life. And we also sort of coordinate the rest of the services in the city and commission some of them in terms of trying to have that kind of all-encompassing partnership approach. So that's what active inclusion is. I'm the service improvement lead within that service. So I coordinate those services, but also have a role corporately for the council in terms of our response to the welfare reforms, the policy on those, communications, project management, all of that kind of thing. So we can start to see then how the services that can impact on someone's life interrelate and think about all those different elements, you know, their accommodation, their employment opportunities, what's happening in terms of their money, their incomings and their outgoings. So our Active Inclusion Newcastle Partnership approach is trying to, I suppose, corral all of the services in the city that can have an input into those areas of someone's life and have a consistent, coordinated approach, which isn't always easy, but that's sort of our aspiration.
So quite ambitious, I think, is a summary for, and it's been great working with you and Neil and the other Claire over the last number of years to see that grow and continue. And I really like the acronym to the extent that we've borrowed 3 of the 4 letters from it for our dashboard, the Low Income Family Tracker. And I think that finding someone somewhere to live, helping them to secure an income and increase that income, become more financially resilient, and find work are all very sensible and straightforward steps. So you've actually got, it sort of describes what you want your advisors to be working on, which I think helps with the cultural change side as well. What about in terms of you guys are a homelessness prevention trailblazer? How did that come about? What made you want to become a trailblazer, and what have you been able to put in place so far?
Yeah, so in terms of that active inclusion approach, that, as I say, we sort of started formally really in 2013. We'd had some interest from central government, including what was then DCLG, and basically we were approached to be an early adopter, homelessness prevention trailblazer, one of 3. In mid-2016. So I suppose what's interesting for, just for context, is that was actually just a couple of weeks before the Homelessness Reduction Bill was started to be presented as a private member's bill. So it does predate the Homelessness Reduction Act, which I think is sort of an important distinction. Although a lot of what we were proposing that we could do in the Homelessness Prevention Trailblazer is very much within the spirit of the Act as well. And I'll go on to sort of explain some tangibles around that in a moment. So that was mid-2016. The Prime Minister then launched the Trailblazer programme as part of a new government homelessness prevention programme in October 2016. And that's when a number of other authorities then bid into the programme to be trailblazers. And I think there's another 28 trailblazers, some of whom we've worked with, some of whom will be on the call alongside the 3 early adopters. And then as many people will know, we officially started the programme in January 2017. So again, that was before the Homelessness Reduction Bill got Royal Assent in April 17. I'm just hearing that I've got a little bit of an echo on me now, so I'm hoping that everyone can still hear me okay. So it's one of the things that we had talked about as part of our early adopter trailblazer proposition was the idea of having what we're calling an inclusion plan. So again, that predated what's come out as a personalised plan in the legislation. But our inclusion plan, which MHCLG have got copies of, a number of other authorities have already had direct copies of ours. We're more than happy to share that again with anyone that's on the call and for people to contact me after the call. We very much wanted that to be part of our Trailblazer programme because that linked with us having, I suppose, a more holistic assessment of someone's needs, particularly in an area where accommodation isn't necessarily an issue. How are we going to identify more rigorously and more meaningfully the support needs that someone has, what led them to their homelessness, what were the underlying causes of that, and then how could we jointly action plan together around that, which then is what's ended up being in a lot of the legislation around identifying support needs and planning together and having a joint role between a resident and a local authority. And that's very much what we've done in our inclusion plan, which reviews some of our Trailblazer funding to work with Us Create, who again I know a number of other authorities have been working with, to have a service design approach to developing that very much in collaboration with both residents but also our frontline practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think 2 things I take away from that. One is the fact that the inclusion approach predated some of the government initiatives, which means it's really something that's been driven locally by yourselves, the team there, for the council and tailored to the residents, but also the fact that that's iterated forward in the context of the Act as it's crystallised. It'd be great to hear a bit more about that approach. We're actually working with us Creates in partnership on another project where we're bringing our more analytical mindset toward understanding who is at risk, and as Creates are bringing that sort of experience of how the teams and individual frontline advisors are working with customers on the front line. I think it's really powerful to bring the two of those elements together. But I do know that, in your approach, you've had frontline advisors working with individual residents and then getting together to talk about the issues and how best to help, and then refining and prototyping new approaches as a result of that. Can you tell me a bit about what you've learned through that process?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so very sort of briefly, just to outline that process, in advance of the Act taking effect earlier this month, we started a process really, I suppose, back in August last year, of working with us Creates and going through, I suppose, a process of collaborative workshops, both with residents who had experienced different types of homelessness. So they could have come through the asylum route, they could have been sofa surfing, they could have been in our statutory temporary accommodation, they could also have been rough sleeping. And luckily we did manage to engage with a good range of people who contributed really well in terms of what their experiences had been in being homeless, but also being assessed around their homelessness, and then what solutions were found for them. We then have gone through the same process with our frontline practitioners and thought about if we're going to have a much more explicit emphasis around identifying support needs and what's led to the homelessness, how will that feel to do that in a standard sort of assessment interview where we've got a set amount of time and we need to draw that information out, but obviously in an appropriate and meaningful way, and trialing different ways of doing that. And that basically took us through until December, where then what popped out at the end of that was basically a document that we then were going to trial pre the Act coming in, and we started that process from January. And I suppose that was taking the service design principles that we were keen to use and Trailblazer funding gave us the opportunity to, rather than just leaping to making changes on our IT, was thinking, well, actually, what would this how does this work in practice in real time? And so we went through a series of prototyping, and I think maybe 11 or 12 different versions of that document through January and February before we then started making the changes to IT. And that included getting feedback from residents, getting feedback from practitioners on a daily basis, changing the documentation, so that then we felt that incorporating also the new monitoring requirements, so the H-click monitoring requirements that have come out from MHCLG, which also helped with our workforce development in terms of preparing the practitioners for both that culture change in the conversation, but also what it was that they were going to need to be filling in on the database as well, and some of that new terminology. And thinking about just finally, Devon, I suppose our learning is also what we're sort of calling bridges, how we're not just suddenly leaping from listening to what someone's told us to straight, going into getting a plan together with them, but how are we bridging that and paraphrasing and reflecting back on what we've heard someone say, and checking that that's then what really is that situation before we then can jointly plan together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating. I think really helpful for everyone on the webinar to hear. And also I'd say probably quite reassuring, given that you went through a number of iterations. For those on the webinar where the Act has just come into force, you feel like they're not quite there yet, recognizing that it's going to take a little bit of time to get there, I'm sure is reassuring. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, as an intro to the next section, the work that you're doing with policy and practice. So what was interesting about it, why you decided to take it on. And I think just as an introduction to that, I think because you mentioned H-click, and obviously there's a requirement to put in this monitoring system across the UK, really. And I think there's a real big difference between monitoring activity, which I think is a lot of what HClick does, and its ability to effectively monitor outcomes, which I know it tries to do, but then again, it requires you guys to keep in touch with the people you're supporting, which I know can be a bit of a challenge. Versus, I think the work we've been doing with you, which has been much more around ensuring that we're tracking the outcomes of the people that you're supporting, as well as identifying them beforehand. But do you want to say a few words about the project we're doing together?
Yeah, definitely. So just before I sort of go into the policy and practice stuff, Steph, just if it's okay just to reflect a little bit on that, on the HClick system, and just so people are aware on the call, a few of them will have already voiced the same opinions, but just so everyone's aware, we are really clear that we need to be monitoring both activity and outcomes for those households that are at risk earlier than 56 days, and HClick doesn't allow us to do that, and so we're almost double running a little bit at the moment, because absolutely from a local perspective, we can't lose that data. We can't lose sight of all of that much more preventative work that we're doing, and the early intervention stuff that we feel is very much within the spirit of the Act, although obviously it's constrained by 56 days. So just to sort of say that we are, and that's something that we are constantly sort of giving feedback back to MHCLG on as well.
Personally, Claire, I think it's shocking, and I think it's a really, I'm sort of conscious of the need to monitor both activity and outcomes, so you can draw the link between the two. But I do think it's a very narrow view just to monitor activities within the narrow confines of the Act, and not think about the wider, not use this as an opportunity to think about the wider support that you could have in place around individuals that may be struggling. So completely agree with you, and I'd love to hear from others that might agree as well.
And I think that leads us sort of nicely into the work that we've been doing with you, because for us, although again, people will be thinking on the call that we are in this very advantageous position because of the accommodation that we've got access to, we are aware that we've got to have quite a tightly controlled system, and if we're not doing the earlier preventative work, we can end up in crisis quite quickly. We've only got 45 units in our statutory temporary accommodation, and say we're fairly determined to not use B&B as far as we can. We haven't used it since 2006, so you can imagine that requires quite a rigorous day-to-day control. So I suppose our interest then came from working with you about maximising the use of the data that we have access to, but in different places and not in a little bit of a messy way. And actually, what is it that we already, as the state, know about households that are at risk of homelessness? And so it sort of follows some of the work that we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, which I know will be familiar with other local authorities that have been doing the same, where we've got some quite straightforward data sets of households, for example, that were affected by a particular welfare reform. So going back to the original sort of bedroom tax introduction in 2013, people will be very familiar with doing a targeted preventative, proactive approach out to people in advance of a specific change that happens on one day. And I suppose and that has really helped us very much, but I suppose we were then wanting to work with policy and practice to take that further and to look at both the cumulative impact of different welfare reforms alongside a whole load of other data sets, which I know you'll go into as well, Devon, in terms of helping us to do that reaching out earlier and going, we feel quite strongly that, in terms of sort of new burdens funding, for example, for the Act, we've got, because in a way you get penalised for doing prevention work in terms of the current funding formula. So we've been able to fund 2 additional members of staff. And bearing in mind that we've only got, half a dozen anyway on the front line doing 24-hour assessment, then we don't have a big housing advice centre. And so we have to be able to, and we're not going to have the luxury of funding to be able to expand that to meet the needs of people coming to queue up in crisis. So we've absolutely got to focus a lot of efforts on finding people before they find us. And we think the data is such a rich source for us to be able to do that, of people that are either in crisis that haven't come to us yet, or are on the journey towards that. And I suppose that's why we were really interested, because we've got some imperative around that as well, which I suppose might not be immediately obvious, but we do have that same imperative in terms of needing to reach out earlier, because we've got to manage that crisis end of things very carefully.
Yeah, and I think the way you described households that hit a crisis and households that I guess have a life that is in crisis really helps to think about the customers that you may already know about and the ones that you perhaps don't. There's clearly a big preventative element to the Act, but I do think it is being read as being quite narrow within 56 days, and I think that is an unfortunate feature and quirk of the Act and legislation, but it's also a missed opportunity, or an opportunity to be taken by those authorities that do want to help and support further downstream. I think it's really important. I'll bring it to life really by diving straight into, and I think this really helped bring it to life with the frontline advisors in Newcastle when we put all the data together and showed it to them in terms of the work that we're doing to identify households at risk of homelessness, the work we're doing to potentially help engage those households, and the work we're hoping to do together to track the effectiveness of your multidisciplinary team, your crack preventative support team, and its effectiveness relative to potentially other types of interventions. So briefly, I'll just run through what we do. So we've taken Newcastle City Council's housing benefit and council tax support data and other household level data around, say, arrears and support payments, and wrapped it all together around the individual. Our data platform links those data sets together over time, so you can see changes in household living standards. So you can see, say, arrears increasing, or the journey that households have taken into homelessness. On top of that, we layer our policy engine and predictive algorithms to understand which households are most at risk of, say, future welfare reform. So as universal credit rolls out, which households will be better off or worse off, which households might be able to deal with rising living costs because they'll also benefit from increases in the national living wage or the personal tax allowance, and which ones won't because they're not in work, for example, and that costs are expected to rise. And in some parts of the country, less so in Newcastle, but in some parts of the country, rents are also expected to increase considerably too, with a view to helping you to identify trends, pinpoint support, and track outcomes. So this is a screen, but rather than a screen from the dashboard, but I guess I'll just walk you guys through it live, just to check you guys can see this screen. I think that's fine. I'm going to show you what we call a Sankey diagram. It looks incredibly complicated, but I'll just walk you through it right now so you can see what it's doing. So you can see 43,729 households in this data set, being tracked from January 2016 all the way to November 2017. Whoops, not sure what I did there. It flicks back to, so you can see, and then you can see changes in their circumstance. So households that are moving into and out of work, for example. In this case, we're interested in households that are are ending up in temporary accommodation or ending up homeless. And I'll just kind of highlight a way to see the journey into homelessness, but also track households beyond. So I'm just flicking to show the tenure screen. And you can see this thin line here of households that are in temporary accommodation. If I just select here and keep only, you can see a tiny sliver of households. So we're zeroing in on 26 households that are in temporary accommodation today, but you can start to see their journeys into temporary accommodation. And I'm doing this live in the dashboard right now. So, it takes a few seconds to load up. But if I remove those households that have been in temporary accommodation throughout that period, you can see the journey that 8 households have taken into temporary accommodation in just a few seconds. So you can start to drill in and understand who these households are. Policy and practice don't know who the households are, but you can, Claire can download this with a unique identifier that she can then map back to identify who those 8 households are. To then move into the household finances screen, which I think was really where this started to really make a connection with the frontline advisors, would you say, Claire?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And where we talked through Claire, if I speak for you for a second and correct me if I'm wrong, I think your identification strategy was effectively initially households that had been suffering from, had faced the penalty of things like the under occupation charge or the bedroom tax or the benefit cap, as being households that were households you knew about that were likely to be struggling. I think the work we did with you was around, say, for example, discussing some alternative identification strategies. So some of those involved, say, households with 2 children or more that when they moved across to universal credit would not have that support for the additional child. How are they they're gonna have to make a choice between looking after their children and paying their rent, and actually getting support to those households would be key. Other groups we talked about, and I think the strategy that you've decided to take forward. Do you want to talk through it, and I'll try and follow you live while doing the demonstration?
Yeah, so just for a little bit of background, the multidisciplinary team that Devon's referring to is funded through our Trailblazer, and we've got basically a caseworker aligned to each of those foundations for a stable life. So we've got a housing specialist who's from our ALMO, Your Homes Newcastle. We've got a welfare rights officer, a debt advisor, and we do have a work coach on loan from DWP as well, which has been a really great addition to the team to be able to bring in that sort of employment and DWP angle as well. So as Devon said, they at the moment this team don't take referrals. They're basically reaching out to people who we think are likely to be having a problem or at risk of homelessness. So the team have been working together since October and have been focusing, as Devon said, on under occupation and the benefit cap, and then moving next month into, as well as a number of other pathways, about using the policy and practice dashboard to identify residents who are at an earlier stage who we might not know about. So the process that we're going through at the moment is just in terms of the screens, we're just doing a little bit, as I said to Devon, over the last couple of weeks of just verification of the data from our point of view. So they're doing some screening on so we're looking at the household finance dashboard and then the households who are financially in crisis. And then because that brought us up to that was quite a large number of 475, we have got in crisis households. So we're looking at the financial resilience now and the financial resilience in 2020. And if they are in crisis in both of those sections, that took us to just a very small group of 43 households, which is quite a manageable number to start to interrogate. And so what my team are doing at the moment is basically doing some more in-depth screening of those 43 households in terms of all of our other databases and the access or the context that we've had with those households to sort of just, I suppose, ratify and verify that data to just see, well, actually, what is it that's happening with those? Because, for example, 4 of them are council housing tenants, and just particularly interested to see the history of those. Are they still in crisis because they've disengaged from a previous advice and support, or have they actually just been missed by some kind of intervention that we've done? There's an owner-occupier in there who's of pension age. So again, is that there's some benefit entitlement missing? You know, what is it that we know about those kind of histories of those individuals? And then our next identification strategy will be going to, rather than looking at the in-crisis households, we'll be reaching out to those households that are more sort of at an earlier stage, so they're either starting to struggle or they're at risk, and starting to reach out to those.
Fantastic. And I think that so I've been, hopefully people have been able to follow that, but I'll just walk you through the screen and then talk to you a little bit about the engagement approach. So we've drilled into these 4 households, and hopefully you saw Claire zero in from 33,000 just to these 4 that are most at risk. We're in this process right now of validating the underlying relevance of this data in terms of that preventative approach. So as Claire mentioned, checking this out against other data sets. But what I'm really excited about is when you actually reach out and start to contact these households. So I'm just going to drill in. I'm just going to drill in here to one of these households and point out that it's perfectly possible now. So to have one of your team approach one of these households, go see them, and actually click a button here that we've not enabled for the demo, but and load up that individual's details in our benefit and budgeting calculator. So you can see a case here for Phil. He's single. All the details around his housing costs and other things are sort of loaded up. and you can see actually support he's eligible for, but also support he may be eligible for that he's not aware of. Child benefit, in this case, universal credit, and how to apply. What would happen if he were to increase his earnings? Actually, let's give him a job. Actually, in this case, if he worked full time, he'd be £820 per month better off. And actions he might be able to take. So in this case, actually, because there's nothing there. And I think the creation of, so we can for each one of those 33,000 households in the data set, we can create actions. And we're talking to, for example, the water company in Newcastle to show whether or not they might qualify for, say, a utility or a water discount, or in this case, just showing you the warm home discount screen, and it shows people how they might be able to take that preventative approach to increase their income, reduce their costs, or take other steps toward independence, such as moving into work. So that just gives you a quick overview. I'm going to flick back onto this screen and move on to questions as quickly as possible. Again, the slides are available. It's not just about preventing homelessness. I think the dashboard has been built to be versatile, to be able to track the effectiveness of different types of policy. So we put some analysis out recently on the effectiveness of the benefit cap and whether or not people being supported through that by various councils were more likely to move into work and avoid the impact of the cap. For example, you can track the impact of future policies, so things like self-employed households. You can see the causal consequences because you're following households over time, and you can start to benchmark the effectiveness, for example, of Claire's multidisciplinary team versus other types of support that's been put forward by the council. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to show the impact of all policies combined and make it relevant to the individual you're trying to work with, because that is really what supports and promotes engagement. So thank you very much for that. I'm really looking forward to the questions. Janet, do you want to field a few of those?
Yeah, certainly. One of the thank you very much, everybody. Just to say that I'm very conscious of the time now, so if we don't get to cover all of the questions that you've put forward, they will be answered in the follow-up communication. So do bear with us. So just one question then, and I suppose it's for both yourself, Devon, and for Claire as well. But for households who are not necessarily on low income now, how do you find them? How do you sort of identify them? There's a question.
Yeah, it's a good challenge. Claire, I'll take this one and feel free to chip in.
Yeah,
but I mean, it was effectively a challenge that was put to us in the early conversations with Newcastle City Council. What we're able to do, and we've got basically a side project where we're looking at all households, for example, that are in rent or council tax arrears with Newcastle City Council or with Your Homes Newcastle, to see in just a one-off case, to see whether or not those households are the same ones that are ending up in temporary accommodation or on the housing register. We haven't completed that project yet, but we are very keen and able to pull together other data sets into this type of analysis. But I think it's something we want to do step by step, and it makes sense to work with that low income cohort in the first instance.
Okay. Excellent. A question, Devon, I know you touched on it there about the data privacy angle. What about GDPR? Someone's mentioned. Anything that you want to cover on that?
I mean, just to say, I think we take it very seriously. Anyone that wants to understand about our approach to GDPR should feel free to get in touch. If it helps your organisation to move things ahead, we see our role as obviously being we're data controllers in the context of, say, HR or marketing data, but actually we're data processors in the context of this project. So in this case, it's Claire and Neil, and in some cases other individuals within the council that are the data controllers. We've documented exactly how we're going to use the data. Actually, we see our roles as helping you guys as data controllers to understand what you can and can't do and be responsible with that. So we're more than happy to engage on that front. I know there have been some challenges, sort of internal challenges with data sharing. Claire, do you want to just sort of touch on how those have been overcome?
Yeah, so I suppose, each local authority will have, different challenges. I know when we've spoken to LGA in recent months as well, whereas some authorities might have difficulties, accessing their children's social care data, which we don't, luckily. Others don't have the same problems that we might have had, say, with revenues and benefits data. So I think it's part of ongoing sort of negotiations, and also trying to demonstrate the value and the usefulness, and I think do that in quite a simplistic and appropriate way as well, in terms of what the gains are for the whole authority as a generally, in terms of working across those kind of boundaries and barriers that there might be with different government with different local authority departments, because I think sometimes people don't sort of maybe realise, some external to a local authority, that it's just as hard for us internally across the departments as it can be between different organisations. So I think that, and it's an ongoing process as well. I mean, I think it's really good, just to add to what Devon said before, that we've got our discretionary housing payment data in there as well, which is really valuable, particularly because then we can start to look at those households that don't have a discretionary housing payment but maybe should have, and think about our targeting of that fund as well.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a great example, because it helps highlight the value to other departments. For example, when you're using the data in slightly different ways to meet. So, for example, we're also able to see households that are on universal credit through the data, and you can entirely see the value in that for I guess a whole range of departments, to be able to see who's on universal credit today, and what, for those that are going to move across, whether or not they'll be better off or worse off in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you both. There's some really interesting questions, and I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer on the questions that are coming through. But I'm afraid we'll move on if that's okay. As I say, people, please, if you've sent questions through, we'll get back to them in the follow-up. Just before I move on to the next steps, and just to give Devon and Claire the last word, there's a slide there just giving you an idea of some of the current clients we're working with. I mentioned Exeter before, and obviously with Claire on the call, but we're working with other councils. So I think the point really is that different types of councils, different but similar challenges and similar solutions. So that's an interesting point to bring out there. And then, just if I may talk to you about the next steps. In the panel on the right hand side, you should be able to see, you should be able to get two downloads. One is a tracking the living standards, which is an overview of the service that we've talked about today, just to give you some information there to share with colleagues and to refresh yourself. And also there is a handy universal credit roadmap for you there to download. There'll be a survey at the end of the webinar when we finish up here now. We'd really love your feedback. We'd like to always improve our webinars, so please do give us your feedback, and also ask for further questions or clarifications. Just jot your notes in there and we'll get back to you as well. You can put your hand up and ask us to take another look at the dashboard. Devon didn't have a lot of time to go through the dashboard, but there's so much in there. And if you want to have another look, then let us know. And also requesting information on just prevention, homelessness, and predictive analytics. We mentioned a couple of reports. I'll put links in that to the email, so the NAO report and the Parliamentary Library report, and also Claire's action plan as well. We'll get them to you in the follow-ups. So that's a quick count about what's going to happen next. A final word from yourself, Devon, and from Claire to finish up with, please.
I think I'll let Claire have the last word. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us on the webinar. I think you guys have been absolutely fantastic, and I'm really sorry. The questions that we've got are absolutely fantastic too, and I'm really sorry we haven't had more time to go through them. We'll try and respond to each one individually, or alternatively try and collate them all in the follow-up email. So if you complete the survey, you should receive some follow-up information as well. So it's probably all, and we'd love to carry on the conversation with you. But Claire, is there anything you wanted to say about the Act, and particularly in its first days? How's it been in the first few days? That's a question I didn't get to ask earlier on, given that it sort of came into force at the start of the month.
Yes, I think in terms of sort of the culture change that was needed, it hasn't been as big a leap for us as it might have been for some other areas. So I think there's always the challenges with something new about, what letter we're sending out, or, those kind of service changes. But in terms of sort of working with the spirit of the Act, that was quite similar to what we were doing before. So we're just seeing it as an opportunity. I suppose just to sort of finally say that the data that we can get is great, but that it's only meaningful if we do something effective with it.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people can get a little bit carried away by thinking, oh yeah, we want access to this as well. But I suppose what's working so far for us is thinking about how that aligns with what we can actually do with it. And to say, through the Trailblazer, we've got the opportunity with our multidisciplinary team to actually use the data and to test it and to try and make some real meaningful change for residents through it. I know my contact details have been shared and are probably on the screen now. So I'm always willing to, we do regularly share with other authorities and with government departments as well. So I am happy to be contacted directly as well as via yourselves. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's brilliant that you guys as a team working with you, Neil, and others has been absolutely fantastic. I'm really looking forward to, as you say, making sure that the data itself improves iteratively through the work with you and with the multidisciplinary team. But that's a process that we're going through with each one of our local authorities. So again, the pace of incremental improvement by working together on initiatives like this is so much faster than I guess trying to do it all individually as a local authority. So I just think that's important to highlight too. Thanks everyone for the questions. We're going to end the webinar now, and any questions, we'd love to carry on the conversation. Take care.
Thank you.